marketing career, Kyra returned to university to study English, earning the Vice Chancellor's Award for Academic Excellence and publishing 2 short stories. The Story Thief is her debut novel, a project nearly a decade in the making. When she's not writing, Kyra enjoys exploring Sydney's art galleries and dreaming of future travels with her husband and 2 children. Thank you so much for joining with me.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
What drew you to writing in the first place?
I think, like most people, I started out as a reader. So I was one of those children that would go to the library and borrow the 10 books on my card and then another 10 on my mum or dad's card. So yeah, it was just reading, and I think, I just dreamt of writing a book one day. It almost felt like I'd been receiving from the community for so long that I had to take a turn at giving something back. But of course, it's a bit harder than that. So I also took the approach that I needed to gather some life experience first. But yeah, there was actually a bit of a funny story to it in that I'm a bit of a planner, type A personality. So as a teenager, I did set life goals for myself, and it was going to be 20s for career, 30s for family, and 40s for writing a book from my villa in Tuscany.
Wow.
So now here I am at the age of 52, and I don't have a villa in Tuscany. But I did come out finally with my novel, and I underestimated how long kids take to raise as well. So I'm still looking after them a bit as well. But I followed most of the plan, yeah.
I think when we're all, as readers, wanting to write us our own stories to get it out there, but I think we do underestimate how much.
I think that's right. It absolutely does, yeah. So this was 10 years in the making, this book.
What inspired your novel, The Story Thief?
Yeah, okay. So the idea for The Story Thief came 10 years ago when I'd gone back to uni as a mature age student. So when we started our family, instead of going back to my career in marketing, I went to uni. And it was there that I read The Drover's Wife by Henry Lawson. And there is a very long-standing literary tradition of drover's wife retellings in this country, going back 50 years. So many people have done their own take on it, just in the same way that you can reinterpret a Shakespearean play from a different perspective. That's what's happened with The Drover's Wife. So I quite fancied the idea of throwing my hat in the ring. What kind of bothered me about Lawson's story was that he describes, it's obviously about a drover's wife, and the husband is absent. And she's the heroine of the story, yet she remains unnamed, and also her 2 daughters remain unnamed in the story, whereas the 2 boys, Jackie and Tommy, are given their names, and even the family dog is named. Alligator is his name. And so it does beg for a feminist retelling.
Definitely.
So my attention went not to the drover's wife, but to one of her little infant baby daughters who was resting on her mother's left hip. And I called her Lillian, and I have imagined her life and that of the women to follow in her family. And I think that what didn't kind of come to me until later, that of what actually drew me to Lawson's story, I think, is probably the setting. So it's set in a remote, unspecified remote outback location, red dirt kind of setting, very humble home. And the funny thing is that my own beginning in life was actually quite like that. So it really took me a while to think about it, because here I live in Sydney and I live in the North Shore, it's all very green. But in fact, my parents were German immigrants. They came to Australia in the 60s, and for 8 years they lived in the South Australian opal fields. And so my first 2 years of life were spent in this tiny little town called Andamuka. And on my website, if anyone's interested, they can have a look at some really great photos of my beginning life, literally in a playpen in the red dirt, or being pushed around by my mum in a pram in front of our very humble little house. And it really is quite like the setting of The Drover's Wife. So I think, when they say sometimes like a story is meant for you, like it comes for you as much as you go for it. So I think I was the right person to kind of reinterpret this story.
And I guess it's also really important to have that feminist view, because a lot of women aren't named in old stories as
Exactly
well.
right.
We need that.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I mean, some people, it's fair to say that, okay, The Drover's Wife, it could be, you could see that as a universal title, one woman to stand for all women. But if you look at the stories of the time, especially Henry Lawson's, I've looked at all of them too, it's always a woman defined in relation to a man. So it's like the free selector's daughter or the farmer's bride or something like that. And you won't find one in reverse. You're not going to find a story like the seamstress's son or the washerwoman's husband, even though women were seamstresses and washerwomen. So yeah, you're exactly right, yeah.
What is your writing process like?
Well, I'm probably... we used to have a dog, a Italian greyhound, and before he would sit down, he would kind of do these circles and circles and circles, and then finally he'd sit. And I reckon that's a bit me sometimes. I'm a little bit scared of starting. The blank page scares the hell out of me. And so I go around in research circles for a very long time until I'm ready to put sort of pen to paper or, fingers to keyboard. But I think I am a planner, so I already in that first year in 2014 when I came across the story, I just started dreaming and planning, and I'd sort of mapped out a little bit the trajectory of where I wanted Lillian, as I called her, where I wanted her to go. And as well as Henry Lawson's story inspiration, there's also a Russell Drysdale painting called The Drover's Wife. So I knew I wanted to take the story through all of that. But then the more I got into it, the more I realised if I was going to follow her life, there was so much Australian history that was sitting there in the background. And how could I started plotting like a fact and fiction timeline, and facts were Australian history and world history, and fiction was my story points. And the more I looked at it, I thought, well, I can't have, World War II occur without there being some major impact on her family. So the more I got into it, the more I was researching and falling down the research rabbit holes. And so I went the long way round. I'm not sure I would recommend it to anybody, but I got there in the end. And I think the story is richer for it because I really immersed myself in that world. It wasn't just research of history books. In fact, that was probably the last thing I did. I actually threw myself into the fiction of the time. So whatever period I was writing about, I would read books and stories and poems that were written in that time, because I wanted to sort of feel how those writers sort of experienced those events. And I was also a lot of research of things like Trove, so the database of Australian newspapers and journals. So I don't read newspapers normally. I have no interest in newspapers, but I like books. For me, the greatest truths are found in fiction and not in newspapers or books. But I have read the newspapers of the 1945, those final couple of weeks of World War II, when they were dropping the bombs in Japan and the nuclear bombs. I was reading every day what was the Sydney Morning Herald saying about that. What were the scientists saying, the church saying, what were the letters to the editor? Because I think when we look back at history, too often we're doing so with the benefit of hindsight.
Yes.
And I really wanted to take away that benefit of hindsight and to plunge my reader into the world as my character lived it and say, okay, day to day, how do we feel about these events? So so I went a long way around, but I think the story's better for it.
You actually get to immerse yourself and be the character of the story as well. You can feel what she would be going through as well.
And it's written, the funny thing too was I'd written the whole thing for years, all the years I was writing it, it was written in third person. So she. We were in her head, but it was still third person. And literally at the 11th hour, right before I submitted to the publisher who signed me, I switched to first person. I just tested out a chapter once. And I was like, oh, so much better. So it's actually very immediate. We are in Lillian's head, and you experience all of those events of history through her eyes. So
we get that connection as a reader as well.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So I know. So I haven't actually told you about the story itself yet. Is that your next question? Or okay. So
how did you go about the actual story?
So let me now tell you what the story is, because it is, in that sense, it's a fiction, obviously. So in my retelling of Lawson's story of The Drover's Wife, my character Lillian is born in 1892 as the daughter of a drover, and she lives in the red dirt country of the Australian outback. And we meet her in 1900 in the prologue of the story when she's 8 years old. And in those first few pages, we experience Lillian's tragedy, which is that she loses her family in a bushfire in that first scene. And she's sent, her father's employer, the drover's employer, he takes pity on her and he sends her to a convent boarding school in Sydney, which is Kincoppin Rose Bay, a real place. And there at school, at the age of 16, when we meet her next, that's when she first reads Henry Lawson's story in class. And based on what she's reading and all of the parallels with her own family, and her brother's names are in there and all these details, she's convinced he's based the story on her family, and that her mother is the original but unnamed and unacknowledged drover's wife. Yeah. And so all of that, but she can't prove it because her name's not in it, or her sister's or her mother's name. And so people don't believe her at first when she tells and speaks up in class. So all of that sets her on a mission to search for the truth and to reclaim her family story. And so we follow Lillian's personal story of love and loss across the backdrop of major events in Australian history like Federation, women's suffrage and 2 world wars. So, I've layered my fiction upon another fiction, but then I have laced it full of fact as well. So there are real people, real places, obviously real events because this is history, but lots of, and I've taken the opportunity to bring to light a lot of overlooked women in history, in literature, some of the female authors, in art, some of the artists, and also Henry Lawson's mother, Louisa Lawson, who was a great, great feminist of her time, but her legend has been long overshadowed by that of her son.
It seems the running theme in history as well, women are just forgotten.
Yeah, exactly.
Or they're always linked with men.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I've tried to do, yeah.
How did you approach character building since you had the Henry Lawson text? Did you do how much of your own character building could you do?
Yes, I think that's probably where then imagination comes in. So I think probably, look, Lillian's character is a little bit inspired by my mum. As I said, my parents were German immigrants, but my mum, she was born in World War II, so her father was absent in war, a little bit like the drover's wife, and her husband absent. And so my mum was raised by her mother and 2 older sisters she had. And then as newlyweds with my dad, they came to Australia. And in those first years of living here, my mum lost a little baby, and she also lost both of her sisters. They died quite young. And so my mum had this sense of being the survivor of her family, and she had also a terrible guilt for leaving her mother behind in Germany. And that experience of being the survivor and the guilt that sometimes comes with that's probably what most informed Lillian's character. And it becomes a story of mothers and daughters, and so it's by no means autobiographical, but I think you can take the truth of somebody's emotions. And so I grew up witnessing those feelings in her, so I think I knew something about it.
You can read that, you can feel that as a reader as well, that it's actually inspired by someone.
Yeah.
That's when we have that connection.
Yeah, I think so. And, my mum passed away a couple of years after I was working on this story in 2016. So she knew what I was doing. She heard the plan of it all. We went to Canberra together. We looked at the painting together. And so that's really important to me. I obviously wrote it through my own grief as well. And I've got a daughter who's 21. And so the other nice thing about this, for a story about mothers and daughters, is that my daughter, she's way more talented than me. She's studying speech pathology, but she's also a musician. So she writes music and sings, and she wrote a beautiful piece of music when she was 16 called Lillian's Song.
Oh,
it's a beautiful piano piece. So she wrote it, dedicated to Lillian, and gave it to me for Mother's Day back then, And that piece of music, people can listen to it on my website, and also even in the audiobook version of The Story Thief, they used it at the beginning and the end of the recording. So, I was considered good enough to do that. So that's a very special feeling to me. So it is very much a personal book, a labour of love. It's not that next year I'm coming out with a brand new story. I will write something else, but it will take a while.
It needs to be a story that you have told as well.
It was very much. And it's a sense of legacy. For me, that's what writing is about. It's about leaving something behind for when we're not here anymore. Yes. Sorry to be so heavy, but
that's what it is. We're always going to survive as well.
Yeah.
What advice would you give a writer working on their first book?
I would say a few things is that I would surround yourself with some fellow writers. So it's good to have a circle of writing buddies where you can encourage each other, because it's a long road and you do need the encouragement. And if possible, include in your circle one writer who actually has been published, because it's nice to know that it's possible. In my case, I was super lucky because I'm friends with Leanne Moriarty, which
very lucky.
so I mean, I knew it was possible. On the other hand, that does set the bar ridiculously high. So it's very bad for some of our mutual friends. They say, "Oh, Kyra, when your book's out, and then they make a Netflix series." I'm like, "Yeah, just calm down. Like, it might not happen."
Start small.
Start small. I know. Yeah. So I would say writing buddies is one of the most important things. And then I would say read voraciously and look at the books that you're reading. What do you like about them? Is it the setting? Is it the world building? Is it the voice that they're written in? So, be a very active reader. And then the third thing would be to do targeted writing courses that address whatever your skill gap is at the moment. So that's going to be different for everyone. I went back to uni, did an actual degree in English in order to read well. And my degree was English and creative writing, so I was doing short stories and things. But a short story is very different to writing a novel, so I kind of learned that on the job. I probably could have done with doing some more targeted courses during that as well. So yeah, that would be my advice.
That's perfect advice. You need to always learn, and the biggest learning is when you're actually doing it, but if you have that gap filler, that's also important.
That's right. Definitely.
Less stressful for you.
Yes, yeah, exactly. You can kind of fast forward your progress a little bit like that. So.
And my final question is, who's been your biggest supporter of your writing?
That's interesting. That is interesting. Do you know, I probably have to say me in the end, I think I have had several supporters, definitely those writing buddies. My husband's supportive, my parents were supportive. But you know what, you're not going to follow a mission like that for 10 years unless you really, really want it. So I think I am my biggest supporter.
Yeah, you have to be motivated yourself to actually get it out and sort of face the challenges and everything. You've got people to cheer you on, but it's all going to be on
and
you at the end.
And now that I'm published, yes, I've had a lot of people, people like, "Oh, I'm so proud of you, I'm so amazed." But in the end, I did it for me. It's the self-satisfaction. So yeah, that's
perfect answer though. You will have to support yourself and be satisfied with your writing as well.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining
Thank
me
you.
today.
Thank you, Emily. What a lovely discussion.